So, hello and welcome. In today's presentation, we will be talking about the Czech national revival and what I found as more important than simple revision of all those Jungmanns and Dobrovskys and stuff like that is to view the Czech national myth, to explain it and put it in the international context of nationalism as such, because these topics will be important when we look at the First Republic, and I think that especially nowadays it is important to understand what nationalism is, what it brought, and how and when it was created. So let's start. What is a nation? You might have heard that during the Middle Ages, John Huss and people around him were talking about nations. There were university nations. You know that there were there was a Czech nation, there were Saxon nations and German nations. And in some sources you can find reference to nation. But there's a huge difference between the nation as the Middle Ages understood it, for example, and nation in the 19th century. The idea of nation as we know it originated in the 19th century during Romanticism, during liberalism, and it's a very democratic notion. Nation in the Middle Ages are the representatives, a special social class of people. And the people, the peasants, the subjects, even townsmen, they don't belong to the nation because they don't have any political rights, and only people with political rights belong to the nation. So it's completely different. Subjects, they don't form a nation in the Middle Ages. If we talk about them as part of nation, we talk about them as they follow the nationality of their leader, of their liege. They cannot choose. While nationality in the romantic liberalist movement nowadays, if you think about it, nationality is something chosen. Nationality, as we define it now, is not born. It is a choice. You can choose to be part of any nation. It's just a matter of what you write in some census. And no state can put you, you are part of a state, you are a citizen of certain state. Citizenship has rules. Nationality doesn't. You can choose to be part of any nation. So nationality is a choice, and everybody can choose. Of course, we choose our nationality usually when we are born. Our parents choose it for us, but you can choose nationality of your child. If you move to a different country, raise your child in a different culture, teach him different language, completely different from your own, the child will be part of a different nation than your own. It's your choice as a parent to choose nationality for your children, and some people choose their nationality as adults as well. So nationality is a choice. And who belongs to a nation? Nowadays, everybody belongs to a nation. Modern nationality, the concept that was born in the 19th century, is something very democratic, very liberal, and everybody is part of a nation. Nationality was one part of democratic processes, and so that is nationality nowadays. So Everybody, including subjects, including peasants, everybody belongs to a nation. The second question, whether nationality is inborn, I've already answered it. When did nationalism begin? Yes, in Romanticism. The father of nationality is Hegel, the philosopher, but only his ideas, his romantic philosophy, is what gave birth to nationalism. And the nationalism in the 19th century is something that we don't understand nowadays. Moreover, because we have seen the terrible things that happened in the First World War and in the Second World War in the name of nationalism. So we're very skeptical about nationalism nowadays, maybe too skeptical, we can say, but we're careful not to be nationalists and not to be called nationalists. It's kind of offense nowadays to be called nationalist. It's like being called a sexist. You are not, nationalism is not in nowadays, but mostly because we've seen what nationalism can do as any other ideology. Why is nationality important? Think for yourself. Why is it important to be part of a nation? The importance is personal for everybody. There are people who would tell you that they have no nationality. Their nationality is of no interest to them. But nationality is part of your identity. National identity is important, and psychologically, nationality is important because any identity is important. Any identity is important because it explains who we are, and if we understand who we are, we understand who the others are. It defines us against them. That's what every identity is here about, and human beings are social, and whatever anyone is trying to tell us, every one of us needs to know who is us and who is them. Our family, our school group, our community, our town, our nation, our state. This is us and that is them. And if we don't know who we are, if we don't know who us is, then we're uncertain and afraid. So the more we are certain about our own identity, including the national one, if it is important, then we can tolerate and accept the other identities. Nationality is important because it forms culture, language, traditions, and it connects us to the past. If you lose your nationality, you either have to have very strong ties to your family history, which we don't nowadays, or to your places history, but otherwise you have no ties to the past, which is very dangerous because then you're floating in the present with no past, and it's psychologically not convenient for human beings. Let's move on from psychology to the national myth. We've been talking last lesson about national or historical memory. National myth is something that explains nation's place in world history. National myth is a myth, and every myth is something that we believe to be true, and it can be true, but also it doesn't have to be. And why we call it a myth is because we believe it even if there's proof against it. Whether the myth is true or not is irrelevant to its importance. So our national myth, or any national myth, explains the place of the nation in the world history and gives meaning to the national history. So every moment, every moment, every battle, every phenomenon, every defeat and every victory, everything the nation did is put in context of this timeline, of this national myth, of this national story, to make sense out of it. And it's important for us because we human beings, we tend to we want to make sense out of everything. We want to know why things happen. And if there were defeats to our nation, if there were victories, we need to understand the story behind it. We need to make sense of it. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, and otherwise, it's not important then, and it doesn't help us. National myth is here to tell us, hey, you are here nowadays because this happened, this happened, this happened, and not only to tell us why that happened and what happened, but also what to do with it now. The problem with the national myth, the Czech national myth, is that it originated during the national revival, and it created the First Republic. The First Republic was the creation of the First Republic and its building and working for the First Republic, and the enthusiasm of people that lived in the First Republic. That was the national myth gave them strength and gave them meaning. Because the creation of the First Republic was the answer to the Czech national myth. But the problem is that our needs nowadays are a little different from the First Republic. We have to deal with a communist history which doesn't really fit in the national myth, nor does the Nazi occupation, and nor does the place in the European Union and other places and other international structures. We have no national myth. Nowadays, our nation would need completely different myth than what we still believe, but that would need a historian that would be such a genius as František Palacký to create one. And nowadays historians are great, but none of them is such a great storyteller as Palacký was. So maybe it's a task for you for the future, for one of you. What is national memory? We've been talking about it last time. It's a part of historical memory that all nations shares together. And I've already talked about the Czech nation and when did it originate. As Czech nation originated in the same time as every other nation originated in the 19th century when nationalism began. Okay, let's dive into different types of nations, how nations define themselves. First, let's look at the basic, what we understand. That's the definition of a nation through language. That's how we see nations defined through languages, because that's how our nation was defined. And the nations around us, like Slovaks and Germans. But this definition through language is not the only one, and we should always remember that there are different types of nations. But if we define the nation through language, then who speaks this language, for example, who speaks Czech, then he or she is Czech. This definition of nation logically brings problems in multilingual states, which the Czech Republic, the First Republic, was. We had very large German majority and Polish majority, but there were states like Poland or Ukraine which were more multilingual, and what this caused later on is very bloody events. Even in the Czech Republic, this posed a problem because before nationalism came, the people around the borders, the Czechs and Germans, and in some other areas, Czechs and Polish, lived together in accord. And somebody told them that you speak Czech, so you are Czech, you are us. They speak German, they are different. They are Germans, they are them. But for the people living in these areas, the German neighbor was closer to them for generations than some politician, some nationalist politician in Prague. So this posed problem. But the nationalist history that originated in the 19th century, the national propaganda and the rise of nationalism was so strong that it managed to break the bonds between the neighbors and communities that existed for generations. Then this language definition provides a problem with history, because what to do with the language minorities that existed in these states in history, how to incorporate them in the national story. What the Czech historians did is that they made Germans the bad guys. The German colonization, which created towns and contributed to the prosperity of the Přemyslic state in the 13th and 14th century, was viewed as something foreign, something negative. And that is the first of many problems. Then here comes the problem with the literary history, because if you are Czech and Slovak and Ukrainian and Polish, then you are presented with a problem that you have no literary history as such, because when the language was suppressed by the government, not used, and you have to reinvent it, then your history is, there are no written works that would reflect the glory of the language. Then there comes the problem of dialects, because if you want to define the nationality by the language, then, well, what is the language? You have to choose the dialect, and you have to choose it well. For example, with the Ukrainians, the Western Ukrainian dialect that it was based on, that it is based on until now, was completely different from the Eastern Ukrainian dialect. And that was a problem in Germany, that was a problem in the Czech nation, and so on. The problem of multilingual areas is clear, and I've talked about it. But let's look at the different definitions of nations. For example, the Austrians. Or the Austrians have, until today, they have a problem about the national identity, because they didn't really know who they were after the First World War. Until the First World War, it was clear the Austrians' glory, the Austrians' history was based on their loyalty to Habsburg dynasty, to the loyalty to the emperor. So their nationality was really the connection to the emperor. When this all ceased and the Habsburg Empire and Austrian dukedom was destroyed, Austria didn't really know what it was, but it was clearly told by the diplomats in Versailles that they were not Germans. Because Germans, after the First World War, the Germans were made to suffer for their nationalism. They were said that they were the perpetrators of the war, so they were to be punished. And if Austrians wanted to be Germans, they had to suffer with the Germans, which they didn't want to, of course. And then Hitler came and explained to the Austrians that they were Germans. And some of them accepted this as a natural thing, because they talked the same language. And after the Second World War, again, the Austrians were told that they are not Germans. This confusion in Austria nowadays causes the fact that they are not very nationalist. Austrians' loyalty, Austrians' national identity is not connected to language. It's much more tied with their culture, with their Alpine culture, and also with their nature. Austrians values the ecology and the respect to nature is one of the main Austrian values, and their alpine and mountain character is what goes through Austria, and it's more important to them than their language. Then we can see the regional nationalism. For example, Switzerland. The Swiss are, even now on, even today, they are very patriotic. Most of them, they love their country and would gladly go to war for it, which is what they are taught since childhood, as Switzerland does not have any regular professional army, that they would one day, if Switzerland stopped being neutral and in every part of the world. But that neutrality is part of their national myth and part of their national identity. But Switzerland is patriotic, and Swiss national identity has nothing to do with language. It's the loyalty to the region. And it's been there since the 16th century, when they were at war with the Habsburgs, with the mountain cantons and lowland cantons that fought together with completely different economical systems and completely different cultures, but somehow they managed to cooperate and stand together, and that is the mystery of Switzerland for most of us. But definitely their loyalty as a nation is to their land, and it's very strict loyalty. They are nationalists to the core, but their nationalism does not come in terms of language. Then here's the Ukraine, for example. Again, the problem was that Ukraine was divided for most of its history, and some of the national revival, some of the perpetrators of the Ukrainian national revival tried to tie Ukrainian nationality with language, but they had to choose the dialect, and they chose the Eastern dialect. But that posed a problem, and it poses problem today in the eastern parts of Ukraine, where their dialect was much closer to Russian. And there was a very big problem with the Russian minority, with people who felt themselves as Ukrainians, didn't want to be part of Russia, but spoke Russian. They are there, even today, some of them fighting for Ukraine, some of them falling prey to Russian propaganda, but they still pose a problem for the country. And we can see the problems of Ukraine, for example, but here the problem of the nationalism was that the eastern Ukraine had completely different history than the western part, and their experience differed, but somehow Ukrainians tied their national identity to the land and to the land, to the land and to the earth, meaning to the agriculture, to the lifestyle. The Ukrainians saw their culture as being the culture of peasants, a rural agricultural culture, and they connected their identity with the region and the main lifestyle. So different parts, different ways of defining a nation. For example, look at the USA. The USA does not even have a language that should be the prominent. Its idea, its national idea, is that they are the land of the immigrants. They are very aware of their history, that without immigration there would be no USA. So they set up the definition of the nation on the values, on the constitution, on the first values of democracy and freedom and stuff. that are defined in the first constitution that were defined by the founding fathers, and that is, for example, the definition of the US nation. That may be the reason why the USA are so eager to export those values to places where people just don't understand those values, because this is their way of promoting their national idea, to promoting their national values. In the Czech Republic, or in the Czech, during the Czech revival, in the Czech kingdom, it was not always clear that the language definition of nation would be used. We have nobility and aristocracy who spoke mostly German, but sometimes knew Czech as well, and they were very patriotic. It's no secret that the National Theatre would not be built without the contribution of Czech nobility. Most basic works, even Palacký's works, were funded by nobility. Czech National Museum was funded by the nobility, and they didn't do it out of national enthusiasm. They did it out of their typical patriotism, their loyalty to their country. The problem of the nobility everywhere, not only in the Czech kingdom, is that their dominions are usually not in one country only, and they have to be loyal to all of them. So when the nationalists came and said, you have to choose your nationality, the nobility was usually lost, because their very essence is internationality. Because no matter what language they spoke, they are loyal to their dominions, to the dominions that their ancestors owned. And if they are in different countries and their subjects speak different languages, it doesn't matter to them. So choosing language and nationality and citizenship posed a very big problem for the nobility. Then there was the regional patriotism, which I spoke about, for example, in the multilingual areas. The people knew that they belonged to, for example, Liberec area, they knew they belonged to the Sudetenland, and they didn't really care about the nation. Then there was historical nationalism, meaning the loyalty to the historical Czech kingdom, no matter the language of those inhabitants. We've talked about the nation in historical sources in the first slide. So, what is history for the nationalism in the 19th century? In the 19th century, history serves the future of the nation. That is clear. Because history that was written during the nationalist era did not want to contribute to historical truth or to scientific purposes, which is what we now try to do and try to prove in and look for this, look for proof in historical sources. In the nationalism, history was to serve certain, was supposed to serve certain idea, certain notion, and that notion was the nation. So nations looked for their identity in the past. They searched for example, inherent traits of their nation. They looked for past victories and proofs of their greatness, either military or literacy or philosophical, whatever. For example, if they had conflict with some nations, like the Czechs and Germans did, they looked for the causes and examples of these conflicts in the past. And if they found a conflict between a Czech and a German, it might have been a completely different causes, but for them, in the nationalist era, it was a proof that Czechs and Germans were always in conflict. That's just an example. So historians at this time did not try to be objective. So it looks like a terrible era to be a historian in, but to be honest, it was the best time to be a historian in, because history was a common topic in the society. Everyone, even in the First Republic, beginning with the National Revival and then through the First Republic, every worker, factory worker would sit in a pub over a beer and discuss national history with his mates over a beer. Everybody talked about history. Historians were national heroes because they taught the national stories, and they wrote to newspapers. Everybody consulted history in newspapers. Everybody talked about history. So historians were public figures, and history was a topic of discussion of everybody, not only the educated people. So it might be the greatest time to be the history teacher in, but of course you had to serve the purpose, because if you didn't and you tried to look for the objective proof or objective truth, you might have become a national villain, as happened to Josef Pekář, for example, during the dispute over the meaning of the Czech history later on. Just a quick look at what contributed to the rise of nationalism as such. The nationalism as such would not be successful without the French Revolution, because the French Revolution brought democracy first. It was the first democratic movement, and very, very early on, the French saw themselves as a nation and led wars through which they tried to export their democratical and nationalistic idea abroad. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, which first exported the ideas. Napoleon founded many states that were supposed to be nationalist states, like Belgium, but also the states like Austria, for example, or Austrian monarchy, who fought against Napoleon, they appalled, or they tried to appeal to national feelings in the minds of the citizens of these countries. So, for example, Napoleonic Wars are the first moment when the Czech people realized that there's some Czech nation and some other nations. Then there was the Industrial Revolution, because without the Industrial Revolution there would be no democracy, no liberalism. We know that, because if you had to work in agriculture with no lightning, no connection to the world, no ideology, no democracy could happen. Yeah, so we have to realize that the technology is what brought democracy, not the other way around. And then there's the ideology, Hegel and his dialectics, and Romanticism as such, that promoted the big ideas, the big thoughts, and the greatness of souls and stuff, because before that, in the Enlightenment, that was not the case. So, national revival as an international movement. Every nation in the 19th century went through their own form of national revival, but every nation was in a different situation. For example, small nations in multilingual, multinational monarchies, the Czechs, the Slovaks, Ukrainians, and the Polish, they all had the same troubles, but of different level. We teach our children about the Czech national revival, about the censorship and the hardships of all our national heroes, but they were going through great times if we compare their situation, for example, to the Slovaks under Hungarian rule, or to the Polish and Ukrainians under the Russian rule. It's no wonder that, for example, the Ukrainian national revival chose the Western Ukrainian dialect and culture to be the basis for the Ukrainian national revival? Because in Russia, they had no option. In Russia, the situation was completely different. While under Austrian monarchy, the national revivals could thrive. So next time you hear about a jail of the nations, think twice, because it was much worse from the East. Then there were the big nations, who were usually divided under foreign rule, like Germans and Italians. What they faced was completely different. They had culture, they had history, and they were big, but they were divided between many states, and what they wanted was not independence, but unification. Then there were the ruling nations in multicultural monarchies. For example, Austria. We've talked about Austrians, and there was, for example, the USA that had to, during the rise of nationalism, had to define. But we can say that the USA, the nationalism, as we see it, as we talk about it now, is a European movement. The USA had different problems at this time. They had problems with their own national identity, with the war of South and North against the South, or the other way around, I don't know. But they had their own different problems with identity and with history. And the nationalism which we talk about now is a European movement. It did not very much touch the nations across the sea. And if we look at the colonial states, their idea of nation was a little different, because their idea of nation was based on them being the colonial power, like the Great Britain. And it posed a problem much later on, when the national movement, very later on in the second half of the 20th century, moved to their colonies. But their nationalist, well, the Great Britain was never that fierce a nationalist nation like France, for example, because it had different problems. If you don't have neighbors that can attack your borders, you're not that much afraid, and you don't have to be so aggressively nationalist. So what is a Czech national myth? We've touched it while we were talking about the 30 Years' War and the Battle on the White Mountain. The Czech national myth that was devised during the national revival, and mostly devised by František Palacký and his successors. It's alive in the heads of Czech people even nowadays, even today, and it incorporates these ideas. First, the glorious Přemysl dynasty. Přemysl dynasty. They are our own. They are the founders. They are like founding fathers. They founded our state. They founded our state identity. And in the thinking of the national revival, they founded our national identity. Although they were Germans here today, which is not seen as a good thing, but they are the heroes, so we forgive them. And we look at the past of Přemysl Otakar II, of Wenceslav II. We look at them and their historical milestones. That is the Czech kingdom in its purest form. Then there are the Luxembourgs, which we don't really know what to do about, because Charles IV is a great one. He's a great hero. But what about to do with John? And what about to do with Wenceslav, who obviously did not do very well for the nation, apart from promoting local alcohol brands? And Zygmunt. What to do with Zygmunt, who is a Hungarian national hero, for example? Because there come the Hussite Wars, and the Hussite Wars are seen as a climax of the national history. We are seen as the predecessors of the Protestant movement, because in one version of the national myth, Hasids were the first Protestants who promoted the Protestant idea, but they came too soon, and they suffered for being too soon with this idea, coming too soon for this idea. Hasid wars are seen as the first wars against our national enemy, against the Germans, and then, which was very much used by the communists, is Hasid wars are seen as the war of democratic nation against the feudals, against the kings, against the nobility. And in Masaryk's idea, which was later on exploited by the communists, the Hasids are seen not only as Democrats, but it should reflect the national trait, the national identity of the Czech nation, which is democracy. We are supposed to be inherently democratic and inclined to freedom, as opposed to the Germans, who are inclined to be despotic and feudalistic. Then come the Habsburgs, and they pose a problem because they are foreign dynasty, they are German speaking, they are Catholic, and as we have seen, Hasid wars are supposed to be inherently Czech. So in this version of the national myth, the Czechs are supposed to be inherently Protestant, so everything Catholic should be antagonistic to the Czech nation. So Habsburgs are made instantly the enemies of the Czechs. Then comes the battle on the White Mountain, which is called, as I've already said in the lesson on the battle on the White Mountain, it's called a national tragedy. Not tragedy for certain religious groups or for certain political ideas, but a national tragedy, which is a complete anachronism because there was no nation at that time, and people of all nations fought on the battle on the White Mountain, and the Germanization came much later on, especially with Joseph II, and it does not have, it really wasn't a national tragedy. But in the eyes of the national myth, this is the national tragedy, and the recatholization that came after it was a tragedy for the nation. Because the Czech nation is supposed to be inherently Protestant, so recatholization must be a tragedy for the nation. And after the 1627, when the new constitution came into power, now comes the period of darkness, and the nation is asleep or dead in some versions of the myth, because then comes the national revival. Then comes the national revival in the 19th century and can revive the nation, bring it back to life. So if the nation was asleep, then it meant the Czech people had to suffer under the Habsburg rule. So the national myth says that 1620 to 1918 is the period of suffering of the whole Czech nation. And when the national revival was complete, it was time for the Czech nation to claim its right place under the sun. That meant to take the rule of its historical kingdom into its own hands, out of the hands of the German-speaking rulers, and build its own state, which it did in 1918, and the origin of the First Republic was in the mythology and ideology of the First Republic said to be a retribution for the Battle on the White Mountain. The celebrations of the Battle on the White Mountain in 1920 were great, and the year 1920, when the First Republic was firmly established, was to be the most glorious celebration, because finally the Battle on the White Mountain, the national tragedy, is retributed and revenged. So that was the Czech national myth. We will look at it and at what the communists did with it, or the Nazis did with it later on, because I believe that later on we can finally get to the 20th century. So have a nice week, and see you next week on Tuesday, this time in person.